Okay, all done. So now you can see that these two representations are equivalent. We have the triples on one side, subject, predicate, object, and this is the same as this graph representation that you've seen here. The graphs are nice to visualize parts of a knowledge base, but obviously, if you have a very large knowledge base, you cannot visualize this all in one graph. Now you'll see we have real world systems that has hundreds of millions or even billions of triples, and then trying to draw everything is not going to work. So these triples we'll have to write in some machine readable format, and the ones that we are going to use here are RDF triples. RDF stands for Resource Description Framework, and as I mentioned, it is one of the standards published by the World Wide Web Consortium. In the W3C, the standards are called recommendations because it's a consortium, but it's basically the same thing as a standard. The first version of RDF came out in 1997. Version 1.0 was published in 1999 with some updates in 2004. And what we are using now is RDF version 1.1, which came out in 2014. RDF isn't the only standard that's relevant for our work. Next week, you'll see RDFS, and then we'll cover Sparkle and a few others of those. So in the very beginning, this can be a bit confusing. If you ever work with web standards, you know that there's always a whole family, a whole zoo of different standards. And it's the same here. You'll later see a couple of those. We'll talk about RDFA, Turtle, N3, and there's a whole bunch more. So basically, you'll get used to it. In the beginning, it's a bit confusing, but yeah, don't get confused. I'll promise it's something you'll just get used to. So how do we write triples in RDF? So now we can see why this is a web standard. So far, we wrote everything out in English and a natural language, but this is not how it's done in practice. Rather, the subject, the predicate, and in most cases, the object are going to be a URI. URI is what you probably know, what you put into a browser, HTTP, HTTPS, and then the name of the domain and the path behind it. It's more correct to talk of IRIs. IRIs are these international versions. You might remember a couple of years back, URIs were extended so that you can also have internationalized characters in there. So you could have French accents or German umlauts or any other kind of Unicode character in a URI. So technically what we're working with are IRIs, but very often I'm just going to say URIs. So the subject and the predicate must be a URI. The object is a URI or IRI. It can also be a literal. So in the example graph that we just looked at, we had the painting, the Mona Lisa, and we had the creator of the painting. So now you can see that what we're looking at here are no longer just strings. In the second case, all three elements, subject, predicate, object, are URIs. And in this case here, the first two are URIs, and the last one is a literal. In this case, it's a string literal, namely the name of the painting. So what you can see here first, the actual painting is represented with a URI. And we'll talk about this in more details later on, but this is a knowledge graph on the web. It's called the Wikidata knowledge graph. And in Wikidata, every entity has a Q number. So the Mona Lisa happens to be the Q number 12418. And now, if you want to give this entity, this painting, a title, we are going to use another URL to express that we want to give it a title. We will talk about this more in the next week. And then we have the actual title, which is the Mona Lisa. And then we had the relationship between the painting and the creator. So again, it's the same entity. This is the URL, the node for the painting. Then we have the predicate, which is creator, again, represented in form of a URL. And then we have an entity representing Leonardo da Vinci. And this entity is in a different knowledge graph. The painting we have in Wikidata, and this one here is another knowledge graph called DBpedia. So before we go further, another task for you on the worksheet. So in the next task, it's the first time where you're going to work with one of these online knowledge graphs. And in this case, we're going to look at DBpedia. I'll talk a bit more about DBpedia in a few slides, but for now, just try to find Concordia University, and you'll see there is more than one. So you'll have to find the right one, the one in Montreal, and find out what the URL is to describe this entity, Concordia University, in the knowledge graph. And once you found it, in task 6, you can call back to the graph that you did in the beginning and replace this simple natural language label Concordia now with the proper URI. And when you're done with that, I will see you in the next lecture part.